and welcome to Something's Off with Andrew Heaton. I'm your host, Andrew Heaton, and I regret nothing. Now, I'm an avowed political orphan. I don't belong on red team or blue team. For truly zealous partisans, that elephant or donkey stamp of approval is very important, but those labels are fairly meaningless to me. For example, I am a big fan of Justin Amash, who is a Republican. That guy, totally invited to my birthday party. But I also think Roy Moore, who's a Republican, is the worst Senate candidate of my entire lifetime. He is invited to my fake birthday across town at the place with the bad music open mic. I used to be a Blue Dog Democrat back before we all got hunted down and slaughtered in the Clone Wars, and I still overlap with a lot of moderate and centrist Democrats. But by that same token, I get turned off by progressive activists who fetishize identity politics or want to pull socialism out of history's septic tank. Those people can all go hang out at my fake birthday over in the asphalt district, while Justin Amash and the unrelated moderates help me pin a tail on a donkey. We talk about American politics like there are two teams, but in reality, there's any number of teams, let's say 9 or 10 teams, and they're constantly reorganizing into different constellations. There's neocons and blue dogs and libertarians and environmentalists, all those different subgroups. There's an apt saying I stumbled onto a few years ago. Europeans have elections, and then they have coalitions. Americans have coalitions, and then we have elections. So when you peel back that red team and blue team label, things start to get interesting. You find unlikely allies, and you start to see interesting fault lines that partisans maybe can't see. And I'm going to give you a prime example of this. I'm going to read a quote from a prominent politician, and I want you to guess who said it. And if you do guess who said it, either email me or post it on Facebook, because I'm curious to see which one of you grabs this when it comes out. So here's the quote. Capitalism has been the greatest driver of prosperity and opportunity the world has ever known. Over the past 25 years, the proportion of people living in extreme poverty has fallen from nearly 40% to under 10%. Last year, American households enjoyed the largest income gains on record, and the poverty rate fell faster than at any point since the 1960s. Wages have risen faster in real terms during the business cycle than in any since the 1970s. These gains would have been impossible without the globalization and technological transformation that drives some of the anxiety behind our current political debate. So who wrote that? That capitalism is the best driver of prosperity in human history, or however he put it. That person is Barack Obama, just before he left office in 2016. The quote is, capitalism has been the greatest driver of prosperity and opportunity the world has ever known. Barack Obama said that the same year that Bernie Sanders brought the socialist label roaring back to life in the American discourse, and about 2 years before Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez put it to a dance beat and slopped it all over Instagram. Now, when I go back to New York, where I used to live, and I hang out with my progressive comedian friends, I can very honestly say, when it comes to capitalism and socialism, me, Barack Obama, and Hillary Clinton are on the same team. Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez are not. Incidentally, this is a fun way to troll these sorts of people who don't know what the definition of socialism is and think socialism is just a synonym for ultra-democrat. If you point out to them that they're not on the same team as Barack Obama, but you are, it's like you're trolling in a top hat. I recommend it. Now, obviously, Barack Obama and I would part ways on a lot of policy prescriptions. He's going to want more regulation, and he operates under a presumption that if something's important, you should probably put an expert in charge of it to run things. I am very skeptical of that disposition. However, him, Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, Justin Amash, me, we all share the base assumption that robust markets are a net good for society. The arguments between us are how much do we regulate the markets, how much do we try to nudge them, or if we should, how big should taxes be, how expansive should social safety nets be. Capitalism has been the greatest driver of prosperity and opportunity the world has ever known, but let's regulate it. That would be Barack Obama's position. That's very different, a very different headspace than capitalism is evil and markets are exploitative. Let's replace them with the state. That's socialism. And we're seeing a new, and in my mind, quite dangerous fissure within the Democratic Party between capitalists like me or Joe Biden and socialists like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Throughout the 80s and the 90s, conservatives of the lazier variety liked to call anyone they disagreed with socialist. A bit like now, how the screechier progressives like to portray anyone they disagree with as racist. Both are really great ways to toss some stupid onto a debate. Here in 2019, we've got actual self-professed socialists like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez carting buckets of Marxism hither and yon. So we have to actually deal with what socialism is, what it means, what it could do. So in a moment, I'm going to bring on my guest, Justin Haskins from the Heartland Institute, to talk about socialism. But before I do that, being a capitalist, I got to pay those bills. And that means a word from our sponsor. Something's Off with Andrew Heaton is brought to you by Toaster Insurance from Factory Farm. A few of you have written in to ask about what situations toaster insurance would cover. I think this is pretty self-explanatory. Basically, you pay a small monthly premium, $100 or so, and if your toaster gets broken or stolen, Factory Farm replaces it. That said, I've been receiving emails from listeners that are somewhat confused by this concept, so let's run through a few of those. Dan writes, I really enjoy toast. I am also very hygienic and have a bath every morning before I go to work. If my toaster is damaged while I'm making bath toast, would that be covered? Technically, yes. Dan, if you accidentally break your toaster while you're making bath toast, whatever that is, it would be covered by Factory Farm. But obviously, you shouldn't make toast while taking a bath. That's very dangerous. In my opinion, you shouldn't have a toaster in your bathroom at all. But yes, hypothetically, Factory Farm would replace your toaster. Mary writes, what if I break my toaster and I'm at fault? My kids do a lot of arts and crafts, and that involves a prodigious amount of hot glue. Last week, I put glue sticks in my toaster to make hot glue while I was taking a bath. Now the toaster doesn't work. Is this covered by Factory Farm? Yes. If your toaster breaks, that's covered. But you really should just buy a hot glue gun. Also, why are you doing arts and crafts in the bath? That's weird and dangerous. Don't do that. Pete writes, the other day I tried to get some glue out of my toaster with a fork, but the fork got stuck, and now the toaster is broke. Then I dropped the toaster when I got out of my bath. Is that covered by Factory Farm? Yeah, technically that's covered. Your toaster's covered by Factory Farm, yes. But please don't try to dislodge crumbs or anything else using a fork, and absolutely 100% don't do it while taking a bath. My God. Obrador writes, my analog toaster makes great toast, but it's terrible at playing 8 tracks. What do I do? From the bath, Obrador. Obrador, I think you're confusing your toaster with some kind of music cassette player. That's not going to work. Tina writes, my husband Timothy died whilst taking a bath. Afterwards, I threw in the toaster to collect the insurance money. Factory Farm has not sent us corpse money yet. When do I get the corpse money? Okay, so here Tina, I think you're confusing life insurance payments with toaster insurance payments. Your husband's death, while lamentable, is actually irrespective of the incident with the toaster. Factory Farm will reimburse you only for the cost of the toaster. It will not give you additional money for the death of your husband. And to answer what I assume would be your next question, yes, if your husband had actually died from making toast while in the bath, because apparently you people are all psychopaths, Factory Farm would still only pay the cost of the toaster. Finally, Timothy writes, last week, my wife and I got into a fight about Marmite. That evening, whilst I was taking a bath, my wife threw a toaster into the tub to try and electrocute me. Fortunately, it was an analog toaster, so it had no effect. I am now in hiding. Can Factory Farm annul my marriage so that I can marry a Protestant? All right, there are a lot of things to unpack here, but I'm not going to. In answer to your question, Timothy, Factory Farm will replace your toaster, nothing more. That's it. Toaster insurance from Factory Farm. We've got your back. We've also got your toaster. Okay, I'm going to bring on my guest in a moment. However, before I do that, I'm going to try a new segment. My producer, Jennings, came up with something. When I'm at parties, I really like talking about places that I've visited. I've traveled a lot. I've been to, I think, over 40 countries at this point. I think I'm coming up on 50. And he suggested this would be a good way for you, the listener, to get to know me a bit better, but also for me to educate you, which is a large remit of the podcast. So we're going to do Travels with Heaton. very quickly. And fittingly, we're going to do, in preparation for the guest I'm about to bring on, a country which was ravaged by communism here a few years ago, Albania, which I visited a couple of years ago, maybe 3 years ago now. I actually flew into Montenegro to get there, which is a neighboring country, and I got picked up by what I later found out was a smuggler that my friend had called to bring me into the country as my sort of Uber, but also not like a fun smuggler. Like fun smuggling would be, guns, drugs, that kind of thing. He was, I think a pasta smuggler, because the tariffs on pasta in this country are so high that people have to drive to airports in Montenegro to get pasta and bring it back in. And I went to a town initially called Koplik, which is I'm going to describe Koplik as sort of a fun version of a Cormac McCarthy novel. Like imagine The Road, only with a yakety sax background track to it. It's a sort of slow-moving apocalypse. People were very nice, had a good time, not a very well-run place. For example, everyone in the town has to wake up at 5 a.m. every single morning. I am not a morning person. I rise from sleep as if from open-heart surgery. I would prefer to never wake up before 9 o'clock if I ever could do so. Everybody has to wake up at 5 o'clock because that's the only time of day that the water pumps work. And you might think, well, I would just skip taking a shower and maybe do it the following day. I'd sleep in. But the water pumps all are about as quiet as a chainsaw disassembling another chainsaw. So you have to wake up at 5 o'clock. I was there in Koplik for a momentous week because the week I showed up was also the first week in Koplik's history that they'd ever had addresses. Prior to that, you just knew where everybody in town lived. It's like a really old school system where you just, the Burt family or whatever lives over by the mosque. The roads don't have names there. There's not Mosque Road or Lake Road. There's the road that goes past the mosque, but if you're talking to people with capital letters, it doesn't make any sense. All of the roads are unnamed, and they put these addresses up. And when I showed up, the addresses were already gone. The local government had put up numbers on the doors and that kind of thing. Everybody woke up 5 a.m. with the sound of chainsaws for those water pumps. Came outside and went, I don't know what this is, and I don't like it. Ripped it off, threw it down. The roads leave something to be desired, although they're getting better. The roads in Albania are all under construction right now because the Prime Minister of Albania owns an asphalt company. So it's sort of inadvertently improving the infrastructure there. But even then, it's kind of problematic because in Koplik, whenever they try and put down a pothole or a manhole cover, someone steals it within like a day. So there's just these giant holes in the road that you run your car into. Or they'll put a tire on top and then fill that with concrete, make kind of an asphalt mogul, which is not a lot of fun to run your car into. The cars are beautiful. There were a lot of BMWs, a lot of Jaguars, and I thought, okay, well, maybe they're spending all their money on cars rather than building these roads. Nope, it's just carjackings. Carjackings from England. They go to England, steal the cars, bring them to Albania, sell them at a discount. So you can get a pretty good car deal if you're in Albania. I enjoyed that. Couple more details about it that struck me out. A lot of dogs in Koplik, and I love dogs. And I was advised very heartily by my very gracious host, because while I'm poking some fun at Albania here, I have to say I had a good time. I liked the people. I would go back. However, I wanted to pet some of the dogs, and they were like, do not pet the dogs. Those are all wild stray dogs, and the government, at some point, like 5 years ago, agreed, I think, to pay everybody like $1 per tail that they brought in of a stray dog that they shot. And they ran out of bullets, which is the only reason this program stopped. But basically, everybody with a gun went out and shot the friendly dogs because they were the easier ones to kill. The more aggressive dogs are still roaming around. And so you have to be very careful about that. Again, I want you to think Cormac McCarthy novel. Finally, I thought this was delightful. The crosswalks have nothing to do with anything. You know crosswalks, right? You've seen those before where you're walking across the street, there's a crosswalk. They didn't have those previously, but some of the guys in town had gone to Germany and seen crosswalks and been like, well, those are cool. I assume that is just like a decoration that you do to spruce up the good part of town. So the crosswalks in Koplik have nothing to do with actual traffic regulations. They're just to indicate like the nicer parts of town. And I'll take from this. Albania has had a little bit of a hard history they've had to deal with really intense feudalism, followed by occupation by the Turks, followed by really drag out white knuckle communism. And they're coming out of it, and I wish them the best of luck, but it was a fun and interesting trip. And that's today's Travel with Heaton. Thank you. My guest today, Justin Haskins.
You got it.
Justin Haskins of the Heartland Institute. You're a champ. I made you sit through 15 minutes of prologue.
Oh, it was great.
Thank you.
I enjoyed it. I really enjoyed it. I was
like,
awkwardly staring at you from the side here. So
that was I once someone when I was in college, someone once told me I make awkwardness elegant, and I thought that is a good credo that I could live with.
That's like one of the best things anyone could say to anyone.
Yeah, that's
else,
like a
right?
superpower. That sounds
really
like an insult, but really, you think about all the awkwardness you bludgeon into in life. That's pretty good. So you're at the Heartland Institute. You're the editor,
the executive editor.
The executive editor.
Yes,
okay, all right.
Executive editor. That's very important. Add the executive in front of it.
And you're in Boston.
I live in Boston.
Okay, right.
Which is obviously America's heartland.
I was about to say, it is geographically, it's indisputably American. It's the ventricle of America.
That's right.
And on top of that, just a super free market city that's just super anti, they haven't had a union there in 400 years and really don't like socialism. So would you, if you're in Boston, because I will say, I've been to Boston once. I had a really good time. I had being from Oklahoma, I had been told that people in Boston are dicks. I thought it was great. People were friendly to me. It was very walkable. And on top of that, we were talking about this off camera. Like when I lived in New York, the Brooklyn accent's all but gone.
Yeah.
Like they're like, "Hey, I'm from Brooklyn. I'm walking here." That's gone. But like that weird porpoise-like Boston accent going strong, and I really like that.
It's like everyone's from The Departed, right?
Yeah. Like, hey, we're going to the party. Like I can't do a Boston accent, but I thought it was charming. I really like. I would if I lived in Boston, I would make my kids take elocution classes. Like I would get them a Scottish tutor or an Oklahoma tutor. That said, though, I had a great time. When you're in Boston, though, and you out yourself as a very free market individual, are people fine with it? Do they?
I don't out myself.
Okay, so you just keep a hat on.
You keep a low profile. Right, you wear the sunglasses with the fake mustache, and you're fine.
Yeah. That's
as long as the hat doesn't say "Make America Great Again" or anything.
I had something to that effect when I was in New York, where I'd like, but I would try and like clarify things where like someone's like, "Hey, I heard you're like a really free market person." I'm like, "I'm free market. Also love gay people." And like it would kind of like, "Oh, okay." So you're
shift
like,
the focus very quickly.
I would at least like get it like into a camera. Like, all right, so he's an evil capitalist, but he's not a bigot. Okay, well we'll let him hang out at the barbecue.
Yeah, in my experience, if you tell people you're a libertarian in the Northeast, they're pretty accepting of that.
Really?
They are relatively accepting of it. Because they say, okay, so you don't like our economic policies, but you're all right with everything else. And so they feel very accepting of that. You're not a racist, you're not a homophobe, you're not a bigot. That's what they assume. So it's actually
hats off to tolerant Massachusetts.
It's well, let's not get crazy here. They're not tolerant per se, but they are that's more tolerant.
That's still far more receptive because I feel like the libertarian label so frequently means either traitor Republican or alternately like evil autistic Republican. But it's this kind of thing where a lot of the time, because like I mentioned earlier, like I was a blue dog for a while, and actually there's a lot of overlap, so I thought markets were good, and I also was fine with gay people. Like, okay, there's a lot of parallels with libertarianism there, right? But jumping labels there, it was not the same thing. Like it was a very different. So I'm glad to hear that that's reasonably receptive.
Reasonably receptive. Yeah, I mean the close proximity of New Hampshire and sort of northern New England, which is very, very libertarian up there.
Live Free or Die State. The Free State Project's up there.
That's it, right? The Free State Project, but even states like Maine, which are run by Democrats. I mean, they're run by
Olympia
Democrats,
Snow
but they're
is up there,
right, and they're more. They definitely lean more either towards the center or libertarian. Even with
that
Democrats.
Sounds great. It's like centrists and libertarian. That's like
very much so.
That's my makeup. We were talking earlier that I'm on the spectrum. Like usually we're talking in America about the left-right spectrum. I'm on a spectrum of Cato to Brookings. So if it's like a bunch of like stodgy moderates drinking beer with libertarians, like I am set.
It sounds very much like northern New England.
Moving into New Hampshire tomorrow. I'll move to New Hampshire when the temperature breaks 100 here in Texas, which is my bigger concern about Texas. So let's talk about socialism.
Yeah.
So you've written a book recently called Socialism's Evil.
Yeah, I'm not hiding what I think of socialism.
It's fairly out front.
Yeah.
Let's start this because I'm going to be doing this every day that I'm in politics for the rest of my life. What is the definition of socialism?
Yeah, that's a great question. The definition of socialism is...
Because it's being a good person and sharing, right? Isn't the definition of socialism just being part of a group and taking care of poor people?
The interesting thing is when they've asked people what they think the definition of socialism is, the number one answer, the plurality of people would say it is equality. That's what socialism is. They equate it with equality. Not even necessarily economic equality, because you might be thinking, well, that's what they're thinking. No, they just mean equality.
Okay.
So people don't know what socialism is, generally. Socialism historically has meant...
That's somewhat accurate, because there have been a lot of very poor egalitarian societies.
Yeah.
And socialism, everybody's equally starving.
And that is true. And that is very true. Historically, socialism simply means collective property ownership and management of that property.
Yeah.
So there's a bunch of different theories about how that plays out. You could have a very small number of people at the top making those decisions on behalf of the collective. That's basically authoritarianism. That's usually how it turns out. You could have democratic socialism, where a majority of people in society decide how that's going to play out, but that's just basically tyranny of the majority. You have all sorts of different ways how you could create this system. The utopian version of socialism, which Karl Marx called communism, is a society in which you really don't even have ruling classes at all. You literally just have property distributed equally across, according to people's needs, across an entire society.
The withering of the state.
Yes.
I'm glad you brought that up. So far, we're very much in sync, Justin. The definition I usually use, which I think is co-sympathetic with what you're saying for socialism, is the government owns the means of production, as opposed to the private sector owning the means of production. Which I liked your definition as well, and I'm glad that you drew the distinction between socialism and communism, because I think in the United States, did you grow up when you I'm in my 30s. I think you're probably in
I'm 31.
You're 31. Okay, so I thought you were your late 20s, early 30s. I was going to nail it. Did you have these posters in your civics class growing up where it explained different government or economic systems with cows?
No.
Oh, so I'm from Oklahoma, and everybody had these posters where it was like fascism's where the government takes your cow and shoots you. Socialism's where it was very clever. Like socialism, everybody gets the same amount of milk. Communism, the government shoots your cow, and I can't remember. It was a lot of shooting cows. Again, I assumed everyone had this experience, but now I'm looking back, going, that might just be an Oklahoma thing where we try and explain civics with cows. Looking back on it, it was glib, and I enjoyed that. But the problem I have with it is we tend to make this, in my mind, artificial distinction between socialism and communism in the United States. I think the definition we tend to mean is communism's mean socialism. Socialism's just sort of sweater vest communism.
Right.
And that's not how communists thought. So when I was doing my master's degree, I took a class on Russian studies, and it was interesting going back through old speeches of the Soviets, where you'll see Khrushchev will say things like, "We're 3 years away from communism," and you're like, "I thought you guys were pretty damn communist right now."
Right.
But communism, in an actual Marxist sense, means this utopian withering of the state. It's the eschaton of socialism. So drawing that distinction, I don't like doing that when people go, oh, well, Cuba's not socialist. No, it's socialist. Yeah. It's just a nasty socialist country. But it's this idea that there's some artificial, or there's some very clear distinction between socialism and communism. I think it's contrived.
Yeah, communist parties historically have not said, oh, this is communism. What they're saying is, we're trying to get there. Yeah. It's a transition. It's all about the transitional period. And really, when you read Communist Manifesto, you see that play out. Karl Marx talks about this transitional period where you're going to have to go from a world where you have property privately owned to a world where you don't have property privately owned. Well, how do we do that transition? How do we get to communism? Well, you get to communism by doing all of these incremental steps of raising income taxes and taking over certain industries and taking over the agricultural part of society and all of these things. And that's really socialism, moving towards communism. But communism is really a kind of socialism. That was how the early communists thought. They saw themselves in this big socialist tent, and the end of Communist Manifesto is actually a really boring, I don't know how many pages it is, but it's a really boring section where they just go through, and Karl Marx talks about all these different socialist parties and socialist groups and what they thought at the time and all of this stuff, and criticizing a lot of them, actually. And
how are they around? If he's the godfather of socialism, where were the socialists?
Socialism was around before Karl Marx, actually.
Okay.
It dates back to earlier in the 1800s. And Karl Marx, he had some very original ideas, but I wouldn't say that he was necessarily the godfather of socialism. He's more so, he's he's definitely the godfather of communism.
Okay.
And his writings were the most influential.
So he's the one that adds that kind of eschatological religious zealotry to it?
Yeah.
Great.
Without question.
Because the one thing that would make socialism better is theocracy.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Well, interestingly, it would make sense, actually, when you think about it. In the early 1800s and even really in the late 1800s, you had a lot of Christian socialists.
Yeah.
You had people saying, look, we're going to create these perfect little societies where everybody's going to voluntarily want to share their wealth, which is interesting because as a libertarian, I don't have any problem with that at all. You want to go off and live in the woods and have a little collective society? Go for it.
It's an interesting phenomenon. I've a recurring theme on the program. I won't veer too heavy onto this, but a recurring theme of the program. I had Tim Carney on last week to talk about his book. We had Sebastian Younger on to talk a few months ago about this idea that we're becoming much more alienated. We're becoming very balkanized, individualistic, and I'm at the point where I have a really emphatic importance I place on the community, but I still want the sovereignty of decisions to rest with the individual, right?
Right.
And I don't see those as mutually exclusive. I think that, like a co-op, when I lived in England, I worked for a co-op. I thought it was a great system. It was basically like a co-op, at least in the English sense. It was a socialist organization that you could voluntarily join, but you didn't have to.
Right.
And it seemed to work pretty well. And I would be fine with that. Like I've actively looked into going on vacation to communes before because I really just want to see if everybody's happy or not. But I'm with you. But the key element is that voluntary coercive thing. And I find too that there are a lot of programs I'd probably be fine with if there were a built-in right to exit, which is a big thing for me. I don't. A lot of the time we get into talking about. Not the force principle. What's the non-aggression principle? Yeah. And I find that term to be kind of clunky. Right to exit, I kind of like. Do whatever you want to do. If you want to form this, get all the, have all the unions agree that we're only going to buy stuff from unions and things. That's great. As long as I don't have to do it,
right.
I might even support you.
Right.
And in fact, if you're doing it cheaper and I think you're nicer to your workers, I might well do it out of economic self-interest and out of moral sympathy for your cause.
Right.
But it's that barrel of a gun that makes me...
Yeah, well, and that's the thing. The key to socialism historically, even going all the way back to Karl Marx, is that you have to have the barrel of the gun eventually.
Yeah.
Because the system...
There's all these holdouts like you and me that won't get with the program.
All these horrible holdouts, these greedy capitalists who just want to keep their own property and live their own lives and not have to go along with all these other things. And so you have to force them to go along with it. And the really interesting part about that is when they were confronted, when a lot of early communists and socialists were confronted with this idea, you're saying, well, you're taking away people's property. I mean, you can imagine in the 1800s how that would be taken, especially in America, right? You just want to steal our property and give it to other people. And their response was, look, capitalists have created all these systems where they've rigged it from the very beginning, and they're pulling all the strings in society. And the only reason you believe that you want capitalism, or the only reason you believe in religion, or the only reason you have all these ideas is because some capitalist tricked you into believing it.
Yes.
And if we could just get rid of them, everyone would just voluntarily want to give away all their property and live in this perfect communistic society. So that was a big part of the equation. And even today, if you talk to a really hardcore socialist, I'm not talking about the politicians, but the actual people who belong to socialist parties.
People with red T-shirts at rallies,
exactly.
That kind of thing.
The people with the Che Guevara T-shirts, living in their mom's basement. Those people. Yeah. If you talk to them, they will tell you that that's what they believe is going to happen. It's inevitable. We're going to get to a world where we all just voluntarily want to live in this communistic society, not just in one society, but in the entire world. We're all going to want it. It's going to happen. Capitalism is not going to survive. They think it's inevitable. And
we're doing pretty well.
It's delusional.
I'm going to say but, on balance, if you're looking at the historical arguments so far, I think the best counter argument isn't socialism, it's social democracy. So you've mentioned democratic socialism earlier, which is sweater vest socialism.
Yeah.
It's socialism, but we get to vote on it as opposed to having a commissar on our behalf, right? Social democracy, which I really wish they would use a different term, because every few years, and in Denmark, this is a great example. The Prime Minister of Denmark flew to America to repudiate Bernie Sanders because Sanders kept going, "Look at Denmark, it's a socialist country, it's great," and he's like, "What? No, we're a market economy." Now they do have higher taxes and they do have a broader social safety net. They also have a lower regulatory state.
Exactly.
And because it's 50 people, if they're spending your money in a weird way, you can go yell at Sven in a way that we can't do.
Well, they also tax lower income people at a very high rate.
Yeah.
It's it's not very the tax system that they have there is not nearly as progressive actually as what we have here in the United States.
I didn't know that. That's interesting.
Where the top 25% of earners in the United States pay like 85% of the income tax revenue. In those countries, it's not the case, and they have all these taxes like value-added taxes, all sorts of consumption taxes, which really is, those hurt poor people more than they hurt anybody else, right? Yeah. And so they're not nearly as concerned with redistributing wealth. They're much more concerned with building sort of collective social programs that they all, can share in. I'm sort of like utility companies for everything, right?
I'm a lot more sympathetic to that position in that, like, my concern with social safety nets is really more to do with their efficacy and whether or not they might have a deleterious effect on intermediate civil institutions like family, churches, things like that. I don't have a problem paying taxes to help someone out if it's going to help them out. So that kind of model appeals to me. It's that the actual socialist mindset of if you're rich, it's because you took advantage of somebody, and we need to punish success in order to. I had a guest on yesterday who I'm very good friends with, but I am very opposed to poverty. I'm not bothered by inequality. In fact, I think inequality is going to absolutely happen if you have a competitive system. And to go back to kind of that 19th century mindset of you just want capitalism because you've been fooled. The great thing about capitalism, and I think that this is the points about capitalism that are frequently mangled in talks are it's not that I think money's great. Like, I'm actually not that materialist of a person. I would not have picked this profession if I were really into money.
Right.
What I am into is freedom. I think freedom's great, and that leads to a very positive outcome, and I want to reserve that right. But also it's this novel idea that while we want to be cooperative, we want to be voluntary, we want to help people, having some skin in the game and having self-interest in the economic system actually creates a mass benefit to the economic system. Like Adam Smith said that it's not out of altruism that the baker is giving you bread; he's doing it to make a buck. But thank God he is.
Right.
Exactly. It's like I'm glad that system's in place. That rising tide lifts all boats.
Yeah, without question. And I think some of the most important things to understand for people about capitalism is that capitalism is simply just freedom. I mean, that's really all it is. I mean, capitalism, I think when people think of capitalism today, especially a lot of younger people, they think of this big, clunky, crony system with all of these, regulations and all these things that are happening. And they think it's just rich people out to screw poor people, and they use this system to do it. And in a lot of ways, that's kind of true. That's basically what's happening, right?
Usually involves the government, too, in order to make that happen. Well,
that's the point. It absolutely does. But capitalism, at its very foundation, is simply, I have property rights, you have property rights, and we get to freely exchange property. That's it. That's really all it is. And so when you make it as simple as that, people are much more willing to say they support it. In fact, the same polls, Gallup did a poll, they do a poll every couple of years where they look at support for socialism, capitalism, that sort of thing. And in 2010, they looked at, they asked people, younger people, do you have a favorable view of socialism, capitalism? And about 50% said they had a favorable view of socialism. And that has not changed since 2010. However,
I'm actually quite glad to hear it hasn't gone up.
Okay, but hold on. When they asked them about capitalism, it was 68% in 2010 said, I have a positive view of this. Now, how does that work itself out where it doesn't, make sense that you have people saying
what are
both?
Those socialist capitalists?
Right.
Yeah.
But 68%. By 2016, that number went from 68% down to 57%. Okay, so dropped very quickly. And then from 2016 to today, it's now dropped down to 45%.
Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is a great dancer, my friend. She's a very good dancer.
And it's persuasive, apparently. Yeah. So when you're seeing that support for capitalism has plummeted, while at the same time, when they ask people, do you support free enterprise? Same exact poll. People said yes, almost 90%. Yeah. So 90% of people say, I love free enterprise. Do you like entrepreneurs? Yeah. 90% of people said that, or 80-something%. But do you like capitalism? Oh, no, I hate capitalism.
I find that the whole argument changes depending on how charismatic the rich person I'm referencing is. So, like, if I'm talking about... and I like interesting you use it because I find the same thing. I find anecdotally that free enterprise is a much better... Because capitalism, I think the term... has merged into a kind of values-based thing as well. My friends that castigate capitalism believe it is synonymous with materialism and greed. And I don't think I'm particularly greedy or anything like that. Although I'll note everyone thinks that they're not greedy.
Right.
But that said, though, it's not a values thing. It's just that can I freely exchange goods with people? Am I allowed to do that? Do I get to keep the things I make?
Right.
Can I sell it whatever I think I want to do? Can I if I want to buy eggs from another state, am I allowed to do that? They're more okay with that, and I find free enterprise is better for that. With socialism, I find that it's this idea that it's just helping people, even though as we've covered, the definition's very different. And on top of that, the historical argument's fairly against it when you apply it writ large.
Right. Now, they don't believe that. What they'll say is those are not real examples of socialism, and they often look to Scandinavia. I mean, I actually believe that the whole Scandinavian is a socialist paradise myth is probably the number one reason why anyone is calling themselves socialist in America today.
Yeah, no one ever cites Venezuela.
No one ever cites Venezuela or North Korea or any of those places.
Cambodia or any of the other countries that have killed millions of people.
It's these tiny little countries with like 5 to 10 million people. That's it. They're the only success stories of socialism in the entire history of the world, which should be a red flag right from the very start. And they're not socialists. So that's a big part of the problem.
And I'll say there too, I would be okay with. I'm fine with I'm a fan of federalism. I think it's a good idea, right? So like we were talking about Vermont and New Hampshire earlier. Vermont, where Bernie Sanders is from, they tried to do single payer health care a few years ago. They couldn't afford it. They had to scrap the program. What I would do if I were a senator is I would try and make it easier for them. Like I would go, look, if you can come up in your state. If you can come up with a system that gets everybody covered, then you don't have to make Medicaid payments anymore. You don't have to make Medicare payments anymore. You can do your. Right now we're trying to keep everybody going to the same thing. Weirdly, I would sort of endorse a European Union type thing where I'm like, hey, go be socialist. That's great. Yeah. Can Texas opt out and have an actual free market system? Well, and I'm not a moron. If we can't make it work and your system works really well, maybe I'll move to Vermont or maybe I'll import it.
Right. Yeah. I think maybe the most important question that we should be asking, and we're not, over the course of really all of these debates that are occurring in society, is if we had a system where states really could do whatever it is that they felt was best in terms of economics while protecting individual civil liberties, right? Yeah. Because that'll be the first thing people object to is, well, so, okay, can Alabama bring slavery back? That's the first thing that they'll point to.
Still get constitutional rights.
Right. But if you are saying just economically, they can all have their own little economic systems, then the question of how much regulation is too much regulation, how many taxes or tax rates, how high is too high, those things will all work themselves out by just having competition between 50 different economies with 50 different ways of regulating and taxing.
Yeah, the whole laboratories of democracy idea that we had a few years back.
If you want to live in a society where the economy may not be so great, but everybody has access to healthcare, health insurance. If you want to live in that society, you could. You move there. Go to Vermont, and if they pay for it themselves and they figure out how to do it, then great. Let's do that. Of course, Democrats don't want to do that because they know that if they allow that to happen and it fails, then the whole thing comes crashing down, which I think is why Barack Obama, interestingly, you talked about Vermont. Vermont wanted to use Obamacare money to help fund this program. And so they applied to the federal government and they said, can we use this money for this different purpose? And the Obama administration said no, which is very interesting because you might think, well, wouldn't Barack Obama want to support this?
Are we trying to help people?
No, of course not. Because if it was a test case that failed, then everyone else would look at it and say, we don't want that. So there's a lot of that kind of manipulation going on here, I think, across the board. But if we just gave states the ability, and I find that argument is very persuasive with younger people, just say, look, let Texas be Texas. Yeah. Let Vermont be Vermont. Wouldn't you love to live in Vermont if it was a little socialist paradise? And a lot of them say, yeah, sure, that sounds great.
Say Scotland's kind of I love Scotland. Right. If I ever move over there, I'm probably not going to make very much noise. It seems to be working pretty well.
Right.
So if they can, I'll add to that. I think that marijuana and sanctuary cities have given an interesting spin to state devolution. Or to states' rights, because it's like it used to be that for good reason states' rights had a correlation with Jim Crow laws and things like that, which were terrible, right? I'm not saying if you're in favor of states' rights, I'm in favor of states' rights that you are, but there were people that were abusing states' rights for that purpose, and then enter California legalizing weed, all of a sudden states' rights sound kind of cool, and or like having sanctuary cities, and it's like, well, we want to have we're not going to apply this federal law. It's like, right, okay, so it's states' rights, except you want it for your city. Like, you understand where this is coming from. Right. Well, I want to throw some. We've got about 10 minutes left. I want to throw some curveballs at you.
Sure.
Okay, so if socialism is the government owning the means of production, would we not then claim that we've got a socialist police system, a socialist military, and a largely socialist education system?
Yeah, I think you can speak about industries in society being socialized without saying the entire society is socialized.
Okay.
So I don't think anyone would think, for instance, that if you had a completely free market economy, but they have collective ownership of roads, that's a socialist society.
Okay. All right. Fair enough. Well done. Well parsed there. So if one of my friends from Britain were to come over and say, well, we socialized our healthcare system and we're doing great, what would your response to that be?
Well, I don't think their socialized healthcare system is doing as well as some of them think. I think if you just have the flu or you need a primary care physician or something like that, other than the long waits, which is a real problem over there, you're probably okay, generally speaking. But if you have a serious health problem, if you get cancer, if you need brain surgery, if you have to have something like that, those countries, all of the statistics show in England and especially in Canada, where I've looked at a lot of the numbers there, it just does not work effectively at all. The wait times for things like neurosurgery in Canada, for instance, it's 10 months.
When they've got a release valve, which is us.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
And it's much harder in a place like England. The release valve is not quite as good there because there is no America right next door, right? But in Canada, you're exactly right. If you have money and you get cancer and you're waiting to see a doctor and it's month 3, if you have any money at all, you're going to America. And it's not hard to do that if you have the money to pay for it yourself. So I don't think that those systems work very well. I acknowledge that they work to some degree, right? It's not total chaos.
They're very popular. They're across the board very popular with their adherents.
But I think that it's only popular until you get cancer. And then once you have cancer, and of course that's a minority in society deals with those problems, right? But if you have cancer, or you have the Alfie Evans situation, or you have these instances where now the government is imposing their will on you, it doesn't seem so great anymore. And again, when you look at cancer mortality rates, when you look at wait times for various specialties, they are much, much worse than the United States. And the United States still has the best healthcare facilities in the world, and I don't think that that's a mistake. People come from all over the world to become doctors and physician's assistants and things like that here because they can make more money doing it. So the profit motive still works, I think.
Okay. So last question for you, Justin. I've enjoyed talking to you very much. I enjoy kicking socialism like a soccer ball. By this time, we're about 40 minutes into the podcast. We've probably lost the diehard socialist listeners by now. If there are some listening, my hat is off to you. Please email me because I'm thrilled that you stuck around. However, I suspect that there are people listening that have a kid that's a sophomore right now that's going to bring up socialism next time they're at Applebee's.
Yeah.
So what is your best for someone that, with good intentions, says socialism is taking care of people. I want to take care of people. I want to have a socialist country is the moral way to do it. What's your elevator pitch against it?
Yeah, I think that the two biggest things that you want to point to is, number one, when socialism has been tried historically, it has failed everywhere it's ever been tried miserably. 167 million people have been imprisoned, exiled, or murdered by socialist and communist parties in the past 100 years. Socialism never works. There's a whole bunch of examples of that, and on basically every continent where there's human beings, it's been tried and it's failed. So that's an important point to make. I think a second important point to make is that these Scandinavian countries are not socialist countries. They're not examples of utopian Marxist socialism, or even what Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez wants. I mean, they all have balanced budgets there.
They do? Wait, really?
They are pretty close to it anyway.
Wow,
much closer than us.
Beating the hell out of us.
Norway has $1 trillion sitting in its sovereign wealth fund.
They've got a surplus?
They have $1 trillion surplus, which is more than $200,000 per
Call
person.
me Nordic.
Yeah,
I'll take their system.
So, I mean, they are not socialist utopias. That's another important point. And the third point is, even if socialism could work economically, it's immoral. And the reason it's immoral, the reason I think it's actually evil, is because in its best, most democratic form, it's a tyranny of the majority. And if you're a moral minority in society, whether that's for religious reasons or for something else, socialism requires that you go along with whatever the majority in society decides. So in a single-payer healthcare system, regardless of what you think about abortion, if you live in a single-payer healthcare system and you think abortion is immoral, you're paying for it if the rest of society thinks it's okay. Physician-assisted suicide, same thing. Contraception services, same same thing. So if you're a nun in a country with single-payer healthcare, you're paying for condoms and you're paying for abortions. You're paying for all these things that you think are wrong. And so I think, and it's not just Christians. If you're living in a socialized agricultural society, and most people in society think, hey, let's eat meat. If you're a Hindu, then you're paying for the slaughterhouses. You're part owner of the slaughterhouse. So I think it's evil. I think it's wrong to force those people to violate their deeply held moral or religious beliefs. And I think that, again, it's not just a religious thing. If you're a member of PETA, for instance, and you don't think we should hurt animals, you live in a society that does, well, then I think that that's immoral. And it's totally and completely anti-diversity. I mean, you're not allowing for any diversity at all. There's no options, no choices. Is nothing. You're forcing people to do things. So socialism is not charity. Socialism is force, coercion, and manipulation. And capitalism, for all of its flaws in terms of the outcomes, is simply just people being freely able to exchange property with each other. That's all it is. So maybe you don't like the outcomes, but at least it's a moral system in that sense.
Well, I'll tell you what, I was on the fence. But well, you've swayed me into the capitalist camp. Justin Haskins, thank you very much for coming on.
Thanks. It was great.
Little listener feedback before we cap off the program. On iTunes, Clint O says, I've been a fan of Heaton ever since I saw his Econ Pop series, as well as Reasons Mostly Weekly. I hope he gets around to doing a stand-up tour on the West Coast. Hint, hint. His guests are also very engaging and serve as a great list of folks to follow on social media. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Clint. I am delighted that you've been there on the journey with me for the long haul. If you came in on Econ Pop and then Mostly Weekly, you warmed the cockles of my heart. Thank you. You can watch this whole show on YouTube if you look for Something's Off with Andrew Heaton. You can see my handsome bearded face and assortment of suits and the dead bison head we screwed to the wall. Watching Something's Off with Andrew Heaton on your toaster will make you seem more sophisticated and amusing. Yes, that's right. You can get a load of this masculine visage even as you turn your Wonder Bread into a saucer-sized crouton. Whatever you do, though, make sure that sucker is insured. So go to YouTube and start watching full episodes. I look like I'm winning the lottery, $5 at a time. Remember, you can always tweet me at Mighty Heaton or Facebook me at facebook.com/Mighty Heaton, or even email me by subscribing to my newsletter and replying when I send it out or when you get your confirmation email, because to be honest with you, it takes a lot of time to write the ads and sketches and everything else, so I've been kind of remiss on the letter of late. But it's a good way to get my email address so you can stay in contact with me. Finally, please subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. That helps other people discover this here political orphanage. Thank you, and good day.